Late at night, in a neglected corner of the city, a lone police cruiser rolled slowly through crumbling streets. The buildings here were mostly abandoned, doors and windows boarded, graffiti sprayed across brick and concrete. A single flickering street lamp lit the intersection where two officers, Charles Reynolds and Clayton Harper, had spent the last hour idling. Bored and restless, they watched for any sign of life to break the monotony of their shift. This area was part of their nightly patrol, a place neither of them liked but both had learned to exploit. Official complaints from residents rarely gained traction, and the pair had grown accustomed to operating with minimal oversight. Reynolds was at the wheel, a tall, narrow-faced man with a perpetual hint of arrogance curling his lips. Next to him sat Harper, stockier, hair thinning at the temples, sipping bitter coffee from a flimsy paper cup. They spoke in low tones about the uneventful night, an unremarkable traffic stop, a couple of noise disturbances called in by weary neighbors. Both men wished for something to release their pent-up energy, some excuse to brandish authority in a place where few dared to resist. They had long ago strayed from the ideals that once guided them, slipping instead into a pattern of low-key intimidation that, so far, no one had challenged effectively. When Harper spotted a solitary figure under the faint glow of a street lamp near an old corner store, he pointed it out to Reynolds. The store had shut down months earlier, its windows now covered by plywood and graffiti, yet a large man in a hooded sweatshirt leaned against the wall as though he belonged there. The two officers exchanged a glance, sharing an unspoken agreement that they should investigate, if only to break up the boredom. Reynolds slowed the cruiser until it lurked just out of the man's direct sight, headlights illuminating him in a harsh beam. They each got out, letting the doors slam, footsteps crunching over loose gravel and broken glass. The man, arms folded, shifted slightly under the scrutiny. His hood cast half his face in shadow, but his broad shoulders were immediately evident, along with an air of complete composure that pricked the officer's confidence. Typically, the presence of the uniform and the glare of headlights made people uneasy. The stranger, however, hardly budged. Harper strode forward, baton at his side, coffee forgotten on the cruiser's hood. He demanded to know what the man was doing out there at 1 a.m, in a neighborhood most people avoided. The stranger answered that he had just come out for some air, in a steady voice that showed no fear. That small show of self-possession annoyed Harper. He scowled and told the man to present identification. Reynolds flanked his partner, one hand drifting near his holster as a casual show of threat. The hooded man replied he wasn't carrying ID, which both officers decided was suspicious. They fell back on the script they often used with people they considered easy targets, accuse them of loitering, of failing to provide the required paperwork, then escalate until the suspect caved. The man, however, gave short, calm replies. He never raised his voice, but neither did he meekly submit. It was exactly the behavior that irked the officers. Reynolds stepped up, eyeing the man's build, the way he carried himself. If he had any sense, he'd have shrunk from them by now. Instead, he watched with quiet intensity as they circled him. When Harper told him to put his hands on the wall, the man hesitated for a second before complying, palms flat against chipped brick. Harper pinned him with a baton while Reynolds frisked for weapons. They found nothing but a battered wallet. No license, no ID, just a credit card labeled M. Tyson. At first, they dismissed the name. One of them joked it could be stolen or fake. Another reason to justify a deeper interrogation. For his part, the man identified himself only as Mike, without offering a last name. When pressed, he just gave them a level stare. The officers read it as defiance. They exchanged a glance, well practiced at turning mild run-ins into displays of dominance. They decided to force the stranger further, especially after Reynolds noticed how big he was, how his arms bulged under his hoodie. Large, but apparently not about to fight two armed policemen in the dead of night. That made him perfect to toy with, or so they believed. They grabbed him by the shoulders, ignoring his low protest, and shoved him toward a decaying telephone pole leaning beside the building. Harper whispered something about rope, recalling a time they had used it to restrain someone else in a similarly dubious scenario. Reynolds nodded, heading back to the cruiser's trunk, rummaging until he extracted a length of old nylon rope they sometimes kept, just in case. He returned to find Harper pressing the man against the pole, batten near his ribs, telling him to keep quiet or face consequences. The man muttered that they were crossing a line, that this was illegal. They scoffed. In their experience, the law seldom came down on cops working the graveyard shift in such a forgotten part of town. They forced his arms behind the pole, winding the rope around his chest and biceps. He braced, a faint groan escaping as they pulled it tight. Harper fastened a final knot with a flourish, then stepped back, batten tapping against his thigh as though congratulating himself. The man, pinned and unable to move, took a slow breath, fury visible in his eyes. Yet, to the officers, that only increased the thrill. They smirked, asking if he wanted to talk back now. He said nothing for a moment, struggling to remain calm. Then, in a restrained tone, he told them they had no idea what they were doing. That made Reynolds laugh. He stepped close, shining a flashlight into the man's face. He glimpsed a partial tattoo near the left eye but thought little of it, focusing instead on the man's frustration. Harper suggested they leave the stranger there for a while as a lesson. Reynolds found the idea appealing. They had done it before. Tie someone up to an object, come back after a patrol loop, see if they'd broken down or begged for release. People without power rarely filed complaints that went anywhere, especially in a neighborhood known for ignoring the authorities out of fear. They assumed this man was just another nobody, maybe someone passing through or living off the grid, not worth respecting, nor worth worrying about. They told him they would handle him later and that he was lucky they didn't go further. Within minutes, the officers returned to their cruiser, glancing back at the hooded shape now bound to the pole. The man stood silent, glaring, sweat glinting on his temple under the street lamp's sickly illumination. They revved the engine, reversed out of the narrow alley, and disappeared into the night. As the hum of the engine faded, a deep stillness enveloped the man. Left alone, he twisted experimentally, ropes biting into his arms. That one detail on his credit card, M. Tyson, was in fact the real name. Mike Tyson, a living legend who once dominated heavyweight boxing. But these men had seen only a big stranger in a hoodie. At first, a surge of anger made him want to roar, to fight. Old instincts from years in the ring threatened to explode. But he recalled the consequences if he flailed blindly. Tied as he was, that might cause serious harm to his joints, or prompt the officers on their return to become more violent. He took a slow breath, forcing calm. In the ring, he had learned to harness aggression with technique. Now, ironically, his training as a boxer didn't help him break free physically, but the discipline might guide him toward escaping methodically. He scanned the dirt and rubble around him. Broken bottles, random junk, damp cardboard, and a few loose nails. Then he spotted a shard of glass, maybe the size of a playing card, lying a foot from his sneaker. If he could shift the shard with his toes, lift it somehow, maybe he could saw through the rope. But his arms were pinned behind the pole. He exhaled, bending at the knees, nudging the shard bit by bit until it was almost under his shoe. It took patience, especially with the rope cutting into his biceps. The distinct tang of old urine and rotting trash stung his nostrils. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the small shuffle of glass scraping the pavement. Eventually, the shard was close enough that he could maneuver the edge between his shoe and the ground. He tilted his foot, precariously balancing the glass. A slight jolt and it might fall or clatter away. After several tense moments, he managed to lift it toward his hands, contorting his shoulder. The rope burned more as he twisted his wrist, but he caught the shard, slicing his palm a bit. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the sting of blood. The next minutes felt like an eternity. He began sawing at the nylon strands near the tightest loop. The angle was awkward, his breathing ragged. Each time a strand frayed, the rope slackened a fraction. He worried about the officers returning, or some other predator from the street deciding to take advantage of a bound man. But he kept going, mindful of the risk, letting each small victory push him further. Eventually, the rope snapped enough for him to yank free, leaving welts on his arms and a cut on his hand. He stepped back from the pole, wiping sweat from his brow, rotating his aching shoulders. Before he could slip away, he heard an engine approaching, tires crackling on gravel. The same cruiser. Perhaps they had decided to come back sooner to gloat. He reflexively moved behind a dumpster, chest pounding. Part of him wanted to run, but something inside told him to stand his ground. He braced for the officers to reappear. Let them see him free. Let them realize their mistake. The patrol car turned into the alley. Its headlights swept over the telephone pole, illuminating only the shredded rope on the ground. Reynolds parked abruptly, cursing under his breath. Both men hopped out. Their flashlights revealed the cut rope. He's gone, Harper spat, scanning. No way he got loose by himself. Then Mike Tyson stepped into the faint light. At that distance, they could see his face, see the bold lines of the swirl-like tattoo curving around his left eye, an image that had once been plastered over sports magazines and television screens. Their eyes widened as recognition dawned. This was not just any big man, but the former heavyweight boxing champion. The realization crashed into them with sickening force. They had not only assaulted an innocent person, but a world-renowned figure who could end their careers with a single phone call. Harper's baton wavered in his grip. "Mr. Tyson," he mumbled, stunned. "We didn't realize." Mike Tyson took a slow step toward them, fists at his sides. The street lamp revealed sweat stains and rope marks on his forearms. "You thought I was nobody," he said, voice dark with anger. "Figured you'd tie me up for fun." Reynolds felt a flash of panic. He recalled the legendary knockouts, the unstoppable force Tyson had once been. He also remembered how easily police brutality cases could blow up in the media if the victim was someone famous. "Look," he blurted, we messed up, but we can fix this. Let's just talk." "Talk?" Tyson echoed, stepping closer. "Talk? After what you did?" His stare bored into them. "You did this to me because you thought you'd get away with it. Who else have you done it to?" Neither officer answered. Fear etched their faces. They glanced at each other, then back at him, uncertain whether to raise their weapons or beg for forgiveness. Harper started to stammer an apology, but Tyson moved with sudden speed, swatting Harper's baton hand aside. The baton clattered on asphalt. Reynolds tried to pull out his own baton, but Tyson knocked it free in a blur of motion. In seconds, both men stood unarmed, hearts hammering. "Pick them up," Tyson warned, "and see what happens." Both officers hesitated, noticing the raw power in the taut lines of his physique, the lethal potential behind his eyes. One punch from him, they realized, could end them. He had always been known for fierce, explosive fists. They stepped back, hands raised in surrender. "We're sorry," Harper managed at last. "We didn't know it was you." Tyson's laughter was cold. "Would it have mattered? If I was just some homeless man, you'd treat me better? Or does it only matter because you recognized my face?" Reynolds tried to speak calmly, though his voice shook. We can figure this out. No need for the department, the press, any lawyers. We'll do whatever you want." Mike Tyson's jaw tightened. He glanced at the rope on the ground, thinking of how helpless he felt. For a moment, rage warred with restraint, the old part of him longing to mete out brutal retribution. But he had learned too well the consequences of losing control. He exhaled, stepping back. "You do anything I want?" he asked softly. "Then promise you'll never do this to anyone again. You understand?" They nodded frantically. "We won't," Reynolds insisted. "We swear. We're sorry, so sorry. We had no clue." Tyson's eyes burned into them. "Sorry for what? Sorry you got caught? Or sorry you think I'll ruin you if I go public?" They had no answer. Guilt laced their expressions. Finally, Harper croaked that they understood, that they wouldn't repeat such an act. Tyson let them see the contempt in his gaze before he jerked his head toward their cruiser. "Then get out of here." They scrambled for the car, not even retrieving their fallen batons, like panicked children fleeing a scene of mischief turned catastrophe. The headlights traced over Tyson's form one last time before the vehicle sped off, tires squealing. He waited until the engine sound vanished into the distance, then slumped against a nearby wall, rubbing the red welts on his arms. Relief mingled with a lingering anger that pulsed through him. After a few minutes, he walked to the main road, ignoring the stares of one or two passers-by who might have recognized him. He used his phone to call a friend, who arrived in an old sedan. The friend was alarmed by Tyson's disheveled appearance, rope marks, and tension in his voice, but Tyson brushed aside immediate questions. They drove off, the city lights flickering past the windows, neither man speaking. Tyson gazed at his reflection in the side mirror, noticing the smudged blood on his palm from the shard of glass. Over the following days, he wrestled with the decision of what to do next. If he announced publicly that 2 police officers tied him to a pole, a media frenzy would erupt, overshadowing everything else in his life. He disliked the idea of turning his private humiliation into a spectacle. Yet he also knew if these officers had the gall to do this to him, they'd likely done worse to others without any recourse. Ultimately, after conferring with a trusted lawyer, he filed a quiet complaint, providing enough evidence to prompt an internal investigation. It remained unofficially verified that the victim was the Mike Tyson. Still, the department recognized the seriousness. Behind the scenes, the 2 officers faced questioning by internal affairs. Rumors spread within the precinct. Most people were stunned that anyone would risk crossing a high-profile figure. Reynolds and Harper's contrived version of events unraveled fast. One, or possibly both, ended up suspended. Some said one was forced to resign quietly. Details never made headlines, leaving local activists murmuring about accountability being served in a hush-hush manner. Tyson, for his part, chose not to stoke publicity, focusing on his own sense of resolution. In the weeks that followed, he returned to his routine. Occasional training sessions in the gym, philanthropic endeavors, public appearances that didn't hint at the violence he had just survived. Privately, though, he carried an anger tempered by gratitude that it hadn't escalated into deadly force. He often thought of how quickly it all happened, how powerless he had been, and how that sense of helplessness had ignited memories of his old life. Times he was forced to fight for survival. Yet this time, he had fought with minimal physical aggression, using only as much force as needed to disarm them. And the rest he handled with a steadiness that came from age and reflection. The incident became a near myth in the area. Some residents whispered that Mike Tyson got tied up by the cops, but no official statement ever confirmed it. Others thought it a wild rumor or a half-baked anecdote. Only a handful of people knew the truth, including the friend who picked him up and the lawyer who filed the paperwork. For Tyson, it served as a lesson about how easily authority could be abused, about how quickly violence could erupt. If it could happen to him, a famed athlete recognized worldwide, what might be happening to those with no platform? Occasionally, as he trained in the ring, practicing jabs or uppercuts, he felt a dull throb in his arms where the rope had dug into his flesh. The scars were faint but real, a subtle reminder. In the mirror, he regarded the distinctive swirl of ink around his eye, recalling how those officers froze when they realized who he was. The difference a name can make, he thought bitterly. But he also recognized how catastrophic it might have been if they'd pulled guns. He'd seen enough tragedies to imagine the headlines. Ex-champion shot in alley after confrontation with police, so he took small comfort that, in the end, no one died. He had walked away, battered but breathing, able to hold them to account in his own way. In the months that followed, he kept supporting local youth programs, quietly urging better community police relations without ever mentioning his personal ordeal. Sometimes he'd meet kids or young adults who complained of rough treatment by certain officers. He listened compassionately, encouraging them to document incidents, to speak up if they felt safe doing so, or find advocates willing to help. He never told them exactly what happened to him, but each conversation reaffirmed that for every high-profile figure who could trigger departmental panic, there were countless ordinary people with no such influence. If his behind-the-scenes complaint led even to a minor crackdown on the type of abuses he'd faced, he considered it a step forward. The 2 officers, their once cocky attitudes gone, left ripples behind them. Some cops whispered the pair had been reckless, humiliating one of the world's most famous boxers. Others considered it pure stupidity. But seldom did they discuss the morality of what Reynolds and Harper had done. The system seldom fosters deep reflection among those who think themselves above consequences. In the end, that was the real heartbreak. It required Tyson's fame to spark any accountability at all. Had he been truly anonymous, he might have simply remained bound to a pole, harmed, or even killed. Though no official press release or sensational trial brought the story to public attention, it settled into a quiet space in Tyson's personal history. Sometimes, late at night, he remembered the rope's tightness, the scorn in the officers' voices, the stench of that grimy alley. He recalled how easily they dismissed him until the moment they recognized his face. The thought made him frown at the injustice. Yet the memory also reminded him that he'd avoided a greater tragedy by exercising self-control. He had proved not only to them but to himself that raw violence need not always be the answer. In his calmer moments, he acknowledged that the best blow he landed was not a punch, but the decision to file a quiet complaint that spooked the entire department into action. And that might do more in the long run to prevent other nobodies from enduring the same cruelty. Time passed. The rope burns faded to thin lines. The city moved on to other stories, other scandals. Tyson continued living his life, seldom dwelling on that night. But whenever he walked similar streets or saw a late-night patrol car cruise by, he felt a churn of emotions. He had once been the baddest man on the planet, champion of the ring, unstoppable in a fight. Yet, in a single moment of abuse by authority, he had been as vulnerable as anyone else. That knowledge humbled him, reinforcing an empathy for those without fame or fortune. Years later, when asked about moments in his life that taught him humility, he would sometimes allude to an encounter with a rogue cop who crossed the line, leaving him with bruises and renewed perspective. He never gave full details. The night in the alley remained his own, a private testament to the fragility of even the strongest among us. Some battles, after all, were won not by throwing the hardest punch, but by walking away to fight another day on different terms. And so the incident served as a reminder. True power isn't always measured in fists. It can also manifest in the decision to restrain them, to speak out more carefully, to remain standing despite intimidation. The city eventually replaced that flickering street lamp. The telephone pole by the corner store was torn down when the building was demolished. The debris and rope vanished, with no visible trace of what once transpired. Yet for Mike Tyson, the memory could never fully be demolished. It lingered like an invisible bruise, pushing him to quietly advocate for changes in policing, to lend an ear to those who felt voiceless, and to hold himself accountable to a different moral code than in his wilder days. On rare occasions, rumors still floated through the neighborhood about two cops tying a big guy to a pole. Some believed it was an urban myth. Others swore they knew the truth. Tyson himself gave the story little fuel, content that the officers had felt a fraction of the fear they had imposed, enough to reconsider their abuse of power. He'd left them with a warning, and they had vanished from that precinct soon after. Perhaps they realized that next time, they might truss up another nobody who turned out to be somebody after all. And so it stood, a strange chapter in the life of a man who had fought in countless arenas, but discovered that a dingy alley and a length of rope could be as harrowing as any championship bout. The lesson, etched in the scars on his arms, was that the lines between strength and vulnerability, fame and anonymity, enforcer and victim, could blur in the blink of an eye. Where raw violence once reigned, now there was reflection, and a resolve to fight the deeper battle against injustice by means more enduring than a clenched fist.